Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions proudly presents Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, as told by Andrew Brammer. Hello and welcome. The story you are about to hear is written and told using its original source materials, scribblings and scratchings from the scrawls of Stumpy, found within Stumpy Sanderson's time capsule, which was buried in 1979 and then unearthed in 2019. The story is told in the first person, as I, just like Stumpy, witnessed at first hand the momentous events which it recounts. So let's park up our rally choppers and tomahawks and take a ride back to 1979 for the fall of the house of King and Hyde. Little did Stumpy Sanderson and I think when we took our first temporary jobs for the Blue Arrow Employment Agency as operatives in a salted nut processing factory that we would one day be involved in the unseating of a tyrant king and his evil henchmen. But then, as one of our agency co-workers was that great left-wing warped mastermind friend of ours, Stephen Brookman, we should have realised that indeed something as out of the ordinary as regicide would occur. The king I refer to was Edward King, the despised production manager, who, together with his Ophidian sidekick Justin Hyde, ruled that factory floor with a dictatorial rod of iron, creating a Nagasaki-like firestorm of terrorization, intimidation, and discrimination within that steaming gulag in which thousands of peanuts, hazelnuts, and cashews were roasted and salted daily upon the broken backs of the workforce. Edward King was a foul behemoth with wild boar's eyes, discoloured bison's teeth, and an ill-fitting treacle-coloured toupee, who moved up and down the production lines looking like he had done something unpleasant in his trousers, sweeping up huge mouthfuls of nuts in his massive Neolithic hands, roaring his commands at you, at the same time blowing a blizzard of belched bad breath all over you, the aftermath of his nightly gargantuan drinking and curry intake. This resulted in him always having to spend an inordinate amount of time in the works toilets, at least 4 times a day. And his accomplice, Justin Hyde, a thoroughly nasty piece of work, who slithered around the factory floor in his white coat. "Yes, Mr. King. No, Mr. King. 3 bags full, Mr. King." A dangerous sycophant with a translucent skull-like face and ladies' hands, who kept in his locker a very unusual collection of Muscle Men magazines. Stumpy Brookman and I had never met anyone so snide as that creepy Mr. Hyde. Now, at the factory, extensive building and maintenance work was being undertaken, which included the building of a new extension, the installation and moving of several production lines, and the bolting of these steel production lines to the concrete floors. Gangs of builders and machine fitters were desperately racing against time, trying to get the factory ready for an impending visit by the company's largest customer, the men from Mars. That is, the Mars Chocolate Factory in Slough, who manufactured Marathon and Topic bars, and to whom the company supplied peanuts and hazelnuts. So it was in that torrid cauldron of a factory, with its blast furnace-like heat, that Stumpy and I were put to work, and, despite our comparatively small sizes, were forced to lug, heave, and empty back-breaking sacks of nuts and salt and heavy barrels of vegetable oil. We hated every minute of this work, but we needed the money. However, for Stephen Brookman, with his freckled face, Chairman Mao hair, and round-rimmed Leon Trotsky glasses, work at the nut factory provided a completely different experience. For as usual, Brookman had been able to apply his left-wing genius to devising ways of escaping the eyes of authority and getting away with doing as little as possible without being caught. He had thus managed to wangle a job in the stores, and spent much of his day sleeping behind the stacked towers of Hessian sacks that stood in the store's area. The rest of the time, when he wasn't asleep, Brookman spent engaged in dialogue with those who worked at the nut factory on a full-time basis, and he quickly ascertained their plight. For Brookman learnt that these full-time workers were being forced to work 7 days a week on terrible pay, and that they had been reduced to the roles of automatons, unblinkingly accepting the cruel thunderbolt commands that were hurled down to them by King and Hyde. Brookman was appalled by these working conditions, and thus began immediate implementation of the Brookman Doctrine, a philosophy that he believed gave him the inalienable right to put a large spoke into the wheels of capitalism and undermine and ultimately bring down those in authority. In that great seditious brain of his, he began devising ways and means of bringing down King and Hyde, for he had determined that these two odious characters were indeed the Goering and Goebbels of the nut-processing world. And it was not long before the seeds of King and Hyde's downfall were sown. For on the very day before the visit by the men from Mars, as Stumpy and I were slaving away on the production line, Stumpy had been pulled off his task by Hyde, had been given a mop, a bucket, and a trolley of cleaning equipment, and had been taken away to where I knew not. It was while we were at lunch in the canteen that Brookman and I were to learn of Stumpy's awful fate and where he had been taken. For just as we had finished our plates of grease, Stumpy appeared, looking like he had seen a phantom, scrubbing brush hair standing even more on end than usual, small hands shaking. "Stumpy, what's the matter? Where have you been?" I asked. Stumpy struggled even to light the Rothmans, which he had put to his lips. "The toilets. Hyde made me clean the toilets. After that Vindaloo swilling brute, Edward King, had been in there." For Brookman, this was the final straw. "That's it. I've heard enough. King and Hyde must fall. I now have the final motive, and by Lenin's tomb, I swear that by tomorrow I will have the means." So now it was D-Day, the day of the big visit by the men from Mars, the day on which the unseen red Bolshevik hand of Brookman would strike, and the factory was in uproar. The builders and machine fitters had still not finished their tasks. The new extension had still not been finished, and some of the steel production lines had still not been bolted to the factory floors. In addition, the factory toilets had mysteriously flooded, meaning that the entire workforce, including the management, was having to go outside instead to use the 5 portaloos that had previously been erected for the sole and exclusive use of the builders. I would add here, although this could not be sworn to or verified by anyone, that the last person seen entering the works toilets while they were still in working order was a strange-looking figure with chairman Mao hair and round-rimmed Trotsky glasses, brandishing a large spanner. When this person left the toilets, still brandishing the large spanner, they had mysteriously flooded. Now, King and Hyde had been charged by the company directors with somehow getting the place shipshape and presentable for inspection. However, Edward King was becoming ever more conspicuous by his increasing absence, having to spend an even more inordinate amount of time running outside to the portaloos. King put this down to an upset stomach caused by his heavier than usual alcohol and curry indulgence from the night before. But we later learned that his condition had been exacerbated, although again this could not be sworn to or verified by anyone, by a furtive hand belonging to a strange-looking figure with Chairman Mao hair and round-rimmed Trotsky glasses, slipping an extra strong laxative into his tea at tea break. Meanwhile, Hyde was charging around on a forklift truck, transporting huge nylon metric ton sacks of nuts on the raised forks. And it was as he was careering around, breaking what little health and safety regulations there were, and as Stumpy and I were working on the production line, that out of the corner of my eye I spotted a furtive pair of hands, belonging to a strange-looking character with Chairman Mao hair and round-rimmed Trotsky glasses, appear from behind a stacked tower of Hessian sacks, grab the rim of a heavy green open barrel of vegetable oil, then push the barrel onto its side, emptying its contents all over the floor. Too late, Hyde desperately tried to swerve to avoid the slick that now spewed in front of him. Instead, he lost control of the forklift truck and spun around like some bizarre carousel rider. Then, with a huge bang, the back of his truck crashed into our production line, which still had not been bolted to the floor. With an ear-splitting rasp, the steel production line grated across the concrete floor, sparks flying everywhere. Just as the production line began to twist and buckle and warp, the giant hopper that it supported, and which contained thousands of nuts, gave a terrible groan and came crashing down to the floor with a great cacophony, creating a veritable Hiroshima of twisted steel and aluminium, exploding peanuts, salt and vegetable oil. The speed at which reactions ran through Stumpy and me as we surveyed this desolation was startling. Firstly, laughter. Then, increasing unease as we saw Hyde's seething reaction to our mirth as he sat atop his forklift truck. Then, as we observed Hyde's translucent features grow ever more twisted and contorted, Stumpy and I were filled with the overwhelming desire for self-preservation, and we took the only natural and sensible course of action open to us. We started to run. The English translation of the Japanese word kamikaze is divine wind. And as Stumpy and I ran through the factory and looked behind us, we realised that Hyde was now putting his own ruthless interpretation upon this word. For we saw him sitting astride the clanking and creaking forklift truck, face filled with murderous intent, as focused as a Mitsubishi Zero pilot, as he bore down upon us, the massive bag of nuts on the raised forks swinging out in front like some bulbous and misshapen wrecking ball. Faster and faster Stumpy and I ran, looking behind us as Hyde swallowed up the yards between us. Faster and faster, just making the flapping factory doors and running out into the bright sunshine of the yard. At that very moment, a maroon Leyland princess swung into the yard, containing the men from Mars. As we cleared the doors, a few seconds later we saw Hyde come crashing through them, and too late he saw the maroon Leyland princess. Desperately he tried to brake, but due to the vegetable oil on the wheels, they spun madly instead and then locked. and even though the forklift truck was slowing up, Hyde had lost the ability to steer the vehicle, and, to his horror, now looming in his path was the row of 5 Portaloos. Stumpy and I counted down the yards. 15 yards. He's got no chance, Stumpy shouted. 10 yards. Yes, he has. He's slowing up. He's going to make it. 5 yards. 4, 3, 2. He's done it. He's stopped. But even though Hyde had managed to bring the truck to a halt, the huge bag of nuts on the end of the forks still carried its own momentum, and, like some monstrous pendulum, swung outwards into the end Portaloo, knocking it over straight into the next one. Like a stack of chemical dominoes, the 5 Portaloos fell, one by one. Then, from deep within the bowels of this carnage, a familiar voice roared, although I will delete the expletives that accompanied the utterances. "What the? Let me out of here!" Ashen, Hyde jumped down and opened the end Portaloo door. And there, lying on his side like some huge beached and now bleached whale, for he was indeed covered with the contents of the comfort station, was Edward King, who thankfully had somehow managed to preserve some semblance of dignity by having restored his trousers to their rightful position. Despairingly, Hyde reached forward to try and help King up, but due to a combination of the vegetable oil and the contents of the Portaloo, instead slid on top of him, and together they grappled and embraced as if in some bizarre insect-like mating ritual. The more they struggled, the tighter the embrace became. By now, the place was in chaos. Other workers had joined Stumpy and me from within the factory and were roaring with laughter and pointing at the sight that they now saw. The men from Mars had got out of their maroon Leyland Princess and were striding up for a closer look. And the thunderous look on the faces of the company directors, who could see everything from the office windows that overlooked the yard, said it all. Finally, King and Hyde managed to stand up, stained and pained. For King in particular, this was part of the final humiliation. For now, wafting over us all, came an overpowering aroma. Truly, the great smell of a brute. It is a sobering experience to watch people's careers flash before their eyes. As they stood there, King and Hyde now knew that, like Robespierre before them, they too were going to perish with the same lack of a fair hearing that they had themselves imposed on countless workers. At the very moment that he had been sitting on his throne, the king had been dethroned, and the only crown he now wore was the halo of flies that had joined him and Hyde from the nearby rubbish compactor. King and Hyde, a pair of busted flushes. As Stumpy and I made our way back into the factory, to congratulatory pats on our backs and cheers from our fellow workers, we saw a strange-looking figure emerge from behind a tower of Hessian sacks. With Chairman Mao hair, round-rimmed Leon Trotsky glasses, and puffing on an enormous Fidel Castro Havana cigar, he gave us a clenched fist salute. The king and his sidekick have fallen? Vive la révolution! Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And don't forget to listen out for Stumpy and Gang's next adventure. For further information on all things Stumpy Sanderson, please visit www.stumpysanderson.co.uk. And you can also check out the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. But before we saddle up again on our rally choppers and tomahawks, let's take a listen to the strange little song that was specially written by Stumpy to accompany this podcast's tale. This song is performed for us now by Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s acoustic archive. Let's rock!
The fall of the house of King and Hyde was a sight for our eyes to behold. And when their castle came crashing down, we rejoiced at those tyrants' fall. And in olden times, they would have been taken down to Tyburn Hill. But for us, the Portaloos fell in line, and those tyrants fell amidst the flies. So the fall of the house of King and Hyde was a sight for our eyes to behold. As like with Robespierre and Saint-Just, there was joy at those tyrants' fall. And in olden times, they would have been taken down to Tyburn Hill. But for us, the Portaloos fell in line, and those tyrants fell amidst the flies. So the fall of the house of King and Hyde was a sight for our eyes to behold. And when their castle came crashing down, we rejoiced at those tyrants'